Fred winced as a soft light crept into the cell, searing his tired eyes. He had no sense of how many hours had passed, whether it had been a few or an entire day folded into one. Time inside this cell moved differently, stretching and contracting without warning, bending to the weight of isolation and worry. He had slept beside Anya, clinging to the fragile warmth of her presence, but now the world pressed back in, heavier than it had ever felt. His body ached in quiet protest, muscles stiff and joints rigid, a lingering echo of the long, unrelenting hours that had come before. Every motion carried its own resistance, yet even as pain grounded him, the simple nearness of her body offered something sacred, a tether to a fragile normality he could barely allow himself to feel. She slept beside him, soft and slow, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm unbroken by fear or anxiety. Her face, relaxed and gentle in the dim light, seemed stripped of the weight of the past weeks, of the tension that normally clung to her every movement. For a long moment, he simply looked, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the slope of her shoulders, the fragile peace that made her seem almost younger than her years. He had never stopped loving her, and seeing her like this, vulnerable, yet somehow indomitable, made him ache with a mix of gratitude and despair. Yet even in the quiet, he knew he could not linger. Decisions waited, lines had to be navigated, and time was slipping through his fingers with a cruel, relentless urgency. Fred moved carefully, careful not to disturb her sleep, shifting from the cot to the cold, unforgiving floor. The chill bit through the soles of his feet, grounding him in the reality he had to face. He rolled his shoulders and stretched his back until the tension in his spine cracked in protest, the dull ache persisting as a reminder of the body he had neglected in favor of guarding hers. He slid into his shoes and approached the small table, fingers stiff as they reached for his phone. The screen lit up immediately, a stark, intrusive glow in the dimness, revealing a flood of missed calls, dozens of them, all from one name, Dilara. His jaw clenched at the sight. He had avoided the phone all day, unwilling to let anything from the world outside intrude on this fragile sanctuary. Yet the weight pressing on his chest told him he could no longer ignore her. His thumb hovered over the call button, torn between the anger that often met her presence and the need to maintain focus on what truly mattered. He glanced back at Anya. In sleep, she seemed almost unguarded, her hand curled beneath her cheek with the innocence of a child, and something knotted painfully in his throat. Finally, he exhaled and pressed the screen. The ringing sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet, each vibration amplifying his tension, until her voice finally came through. "Fred," she said, calm, controlled, yet threaded with strain, her weariness audible beneath the surface. "I was starting to think you wouldn't call back. I didn't mean to ignore you," he said, voice low and steady. "I've just been here, with her." There was a quiet pause, not defensive, but simply present. "I understand. I know how much this must be taking out of you. I only called because I needed to speak with you." Fred leaned against the cool wall, eyes drifting to the cot, to the shape of Anya beneath the thin blanket. He steadied himself. "Go ahead. She's my daughter," Dilara said, voice steady but threaded with tremor. "I know I've made mistakes. I've pushed too hard, controlled too much, but I never wanted her to end up like this. I'm not trying to make things worse for you or for her." Fred felt his jaw tighten. The honesty in her tone was disarming. He hadn't expected it. "I didn't want this either," he said quietly. "None of it. I'm doing everything I can to get her out, but it's going to take time, more time than she deserves to wait." "I know," she replied softly. "And I'm grateful, truly. We both want the same thing," Fred said, voice firm, carrying a quiet determination. "Anya's freedom, her peace. I don't care about the past anymore, not if it gets in the way of that." "I've been angry for so long," she admitted, and the vulnerability in her tone cracked through the cool surface. "I thought I was doing what was best for her, but maybe I was only doing what was best for me. Maybe I couldn't see the difference." Fred didn't answer immediately. He felt the rawness of her admission, the exposure of her flaws, and he recognized that she was no longer the enemy. "I'm not against you, Fred," she added, her voice gentler, almost pleading. "I know it's hard to believe, but I'm not. I believe you," he said, surprising himself with the certainty of the words. "We're on the same side now." A silence settled over the line, not cold but tentative, a quiet truce forged without ceremony. "I just want her to be free," Dilara whispered, her voice trembling slightly, heavy with longing. "To have the life she's always deserved." "She will," Fred said firmly, his voice steady with resolve. "I'll make sure of it." Another pause stretched between them, but now it carried understanding rather than tension. "I should let you go," Dilara said at last, and the edge of her voice softened. "But Fred, keep her safe." "I will," he replied without hesitation, Nothing will happen to her while I'm still standing. He could hear the slight quiver of relief in her breath, and for a moment, the hardness of the world softened just enough to let hope slip through. "Fred," she said again, voice fragile and human this time. "Can I see her? Just for a moment, please. I need to know she's okay." Fred's heart clenched. The pull of duty, the weight of risk, and the gravity of love collided in him. There were countless reasons to refuse, yet he thought of Anya, her resilience, her fragile trust, and he knew this was something she needed too. He studied her sleeping form again, her chest rising and falling in gentle rhythm, and finally spoke. "I'll speak to Ian," he said, careful and measured. "I can't promise anything. It has to be controlled, discreet." "I understand," Dilara replied, but her tone carried a fragile hope. "I just want her to know I'm here, that I haven't given up on her, that I won't give up." Fred felt something shift within him, a dam long held back finally yielding. She sounded like a mother, human and willing, and maybe that was enough. "I'll do what I can," he said, gentler now. "Give me some time. I won't make this harder for her. I swear it," she said. Fred nodded, though she could not see it. "I'll talk to Ian. I'll let you know what's possible." "Thank you," she murmured. "And Fred, please, take care of her. She needs you." "I know," he said simply. "And I will." The line went silent, then clicked, leaving Fred staring at the black screen in his hand. His thoughts moved like smoke, curling and fading into one another. He hadn't expected the conversation to leave him feeling more human, more tethered to something beyond the endless tide of duty and despair, but it had. Pain remained, mistrust lingered, yet hope now threaded through them both. He turned back to the cot, walking slowly and deliberately. Anya had not stirred. Her hair spilled across the pillow in tangled waves, her small fingers curled near her lips as though guarding a piece of her soul. Fred knelt beside her, brushing the hair back gently from her face, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his fingers, alive and present. He let out a long, uneven breath, closing his eyes briefly to gather himself. 1,000 battles still waited beyond the walls of the cell, but in this moment, he had made promises, one to Dilara, one to Anya, one he would keep with every measure of strength and devotion he had left. Fred stepped quietly out of the cell, his hand lingering on the edge of the door as if the moment itself demanded a silent farewell. He glanced back once more at Anya, lying still beneath the pale, flickering light, her features softened in the fragile quiet of sleep, her breath steady but shallow, a rhythm that seemed almost too delicate for the weight of the world pressing outside these walls. He did not lock the door. He could not bring himself to do it. There was something in the raw, quiet vulnerability of her presence, in the unspoken trust she placed in him, that made the act impossible. He left the door slightly ajar, a quiet testimony of his presence, a promise folded into the air, as if to say he was there. Perhaps in that subtle gesture, in the small gap of light and shadow, she might feel the faint assurance that she was not truly alone in a world that had grown harsh and unyielding. His footsteps fell lightly against the worn floor of the corridor, each one carrying more weight than the last, pressing with the storm of thoughts that raged in his mind. Every step echoed faintly, bouncing off the cold walls as he moved toward Ian's office. He found him hunched over a tangle of files and reports, the rigid posture, familiar, yet different in this tense morning light, the lines of concentration sharp and braced, as if anticipating a strike. Fred had seen Ian in this state countless times before, resolute and precise, a man bound by the relentless machinery of duty. Yet now there was an edge, a tautness that suggested the possibility of fracture. Ian did not lift his eyes as Fred entered, the silence stretching in the space between them, brittle and charged with expectation. "I spoke to her mother," Fred began, his voice low but unyielding, carrying the weight of inevitability. "Dilara wants to see Anya." Ian's pen paused mid-note, the scratch of graphite against paper momentarily halted, before his eyes lifted, sharp and unreadable. "Come again." "She's on her way," Fred continued, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without flinch. "I told her she could see Anya. Just for a moment. I'll be there the entire time." The expression on Ian's face shifted, surprise settling into a harder, sterner mask, jaw tight and eyes narrowing with the tension of disbelief. "Fred, you can't." "I can," Fred interrupted, his tone threaded with steel and certainty. "Anya has a right to see her mother, whether you approve or not." He stepped closer, lowering his voice with deliberate intent, a measured force behind each word. "I already gave my word. It is happening." Ian exhaled sharply, the air from his lungs cutting through the charged quiet, his face rigid with the weight of frustration and the calculation of risk. "You're playing with fire. If this leaks, if anyone finds out, we're finished." Fred inclined his head once, curt and resolute. "I understand the risks," he said, letting the words hang in the air like a challenge folded into loyalty. For a long moment, Ian simply studied him, the office heavy with unspoken arguments and potential consequences, before he finally gave a long, weary sigh. Fine, I'll make the arrangements. But if this backfires, Fred, it is on you. He turned back to the cluttered desk, dismissing the conversation with a tension that spoke as loudly as any words. I'll ensure surveillance is discreet. Fred did not respond with more than a single acknowledgement. He pulled out his phone and dialed, fingers trembling slightly, yet his voice remained steady when he spoke. Fred, Delara's voice answered on the first ring, soft, fragile, threaded with a cautious hope. Have you spoken to someone? I have, Fred said, casting a glance toward Ian before lowering his voice, careful to maintain a controlled distance. It's done. Come now, quietly. No escorts, no drivers. No one can know. A pause followed, weighted and delicate, carrying a breath of relief, or perhaps the fragile stirrings of trust beginning to take root. I'll be there in 15 minutes, she said at last, the measure of her words precise, but with an undercurrent of emotion she did not fully mask. When the call ended, Fred slipped the phone into his pocket, leaning against the wall for a moment, letting the gravity of what he had set in motion settle on his shoulders. The weight was tangible, pressing down with guilt and the knowledge of inevitable consequences. But beneath it, there was something stronger, something determined. Anya needed this, and no matter the cost, he would see it through. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself for what was to come, knowing the choices he had made could not be undone. Fred stood a little apart from the curb, shoulders set like a man bracing against a wind that had nothing to do with weather, scanning the street with a patience that was actually the opposite of patience. The city moved around him in indifferent rhythm, the sound of taxis, the soft thud of footsteps, a bird calling once and gone, and beneath it all, his own breath, small and precise. When the black Range Rover eased to a stop, the world narrowed to the vehicle and the woman who stepped from it, a figure composed of angles and quiet fury, a dress like spilled ink falling around her. Delara's heels clicked with a kind of promise as she crossed the pavement. Her glance took in the building, the passers-by, his face, and finally rested on him, as if measuring how much of the old weather they could brave together. She came to him without preamble and folded herself into his arms. Her embrace was brief, fierce, and real, a mother closing cracks that had been open for too long. He held her, the press of her body grounding him, a remnant of everything both of them had tried and failed to fix. This wasn't only about Anya, he thought. It was about all the past that had tangled them up and left them half known to one another. Thank you, she said, voice muffled against his chest. The words were small, but they carried the weight of flight and fear. I promised, he answered, meeting her eyes as he stepped back. This stays between us. No one can know. She nodded. Her hands, long and steady, rested an instant on his sleeve, as if checking the warmth there. I'm not here to stir trouble, she said. I only want her to know that she is loved, to let her know that she is not alone. He watched her then, the tightness around her mouth, the way her fingers moved as if composing a letter in the air. Ian stood in the doorway and caught his eye. Fred gave the barest of nods. It was time. He led them through the corridors with careful steps, the station's light muting into a kind of hush, as if even the building held its breath for what was coming. The door to Anya's cell was left lightly ajar, not latched shut but not open wide either, an invitation that felt fragile and safe at once. Fred stepped aside and let Delara enter first. He did not move to fill the silence with words. There was nothing to say that would not sound false or small. Delara's heels were softer now on the concrete as she crossed the threshold and sank to her knees beside the narrow cot. Anya lay curled, thin shapes of shadow tracing the hollows of her cheeks, hair spilling like a dark tide. Delara's hand hovered a moment over that hair before it brushed it aside with a tenderness that could have healed the world. The moment stretched, and Anya stirred, eyes opening slow and wide in the dim, confusion melting into recognition, until the single sound she made broke all the restraint in the room. Mama, she whispered, fragile as a thread. Delara's control shattered. Tears came where she had kept steel. She leaned forward until her face hovered above her child's, and the first words that found her were not polished statements of will, but the raw language of a heart returning to a long-lost shore. I'm here, Anya. I'm here, she said, and the syllables landed like vows. Anya pushed herself up, every movement thin with exhaustion. Mama, She stopped, the words tangling in the memory of cold hands and bright lights. I didn't do it. For a long beat, Delara simply watched the honesty in that confession and answered with a certainty that unclenched the muscles in the smaller woman's face. I know, she said, fierce and low. I know, my baby. Her hands closed around Anya's face like anchors. They will listen. I will make them listen. I have the records, the alibis, the proof. You were not there. Anya's sob came like something that had been held too long. They locked me up. No one believed me. They locked me up. Dilara gathered her in the space the world had refused to hold. I believe you, she said, again and again, until the words sunk into Anya. I will fight for you. I will tear this apart if I have to. Her voice held steel, but it was the tenderness beneath the steel that steadied Anya's breath. She began to stroke the length of her daughter's back, small, steady motions that said more than speech. Fred remained by the doorway, watching mother and daughter stitch themselves back together in the narrow light. The uniform on him felt suddenly like a thing he had to step out of, but he did not move. This moment belonged to them. Still, he spoke once, low enough that only they could hear. Kai's safe, by the way, he said simply. My parents have her. She is looked after. Dilara lifted her head and met his gaze across the small room. There was gratitude there, fierce and immediate, and an old hurt too, raw and complicated. Thank you, she said, and the word was private and vast. She reached up and brushed Anya's cheek with a thumb, and then, as if the presence of guards and cameras were a distant shore, whispered something only a mother could. Anya's fingers tightened around her sleeve, and for a long minute neither woman spoke. When at last they drew back, it was with slow reluctance. Dilara placed a kiss on Anya's forehead and whispered a promise that had the weight of all the resources and wrath she could muster. They will not keep you here, she said. Not if I can help it. I swear it. Anya smiled then, fragile and honest, and it held a light that made the room breathe differently.